questions we wrestle with as Christians about who God is, how do we live out our faith, what is the Bible, what is the truth of the Bible, what are we supposed to believe, how are we supposed to live? There are really big, deep questions that we ask each other, that we ask God, that we wrestle with ourselves. And that's why the Cultivate Podcast exists, to help us go deeper in our understanding of who God is, His Word, and the way that He's called us to live. Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us on the Cultivate Podcast. And this is kind of episode 3 of a mini-series as part of even a larger series. We kind of were working our way through some topics that we're covering in our summer seminar and talking to the different speakers for that. And we have with us Old Testament expert. I want to say expert on the nature of God, but that feels a little... that feels like Facebook. We determined last time you're a wrestling expert. The fact that you quickly came up with Undertaker was really important, and then the insight you gave on theological wrestling feels really great. Scott Sutton, general expert here with us. So glad that you're back here with us. And we started by asking the question: is the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament the same? And we answered it very quickly with
yes.
Yes, perfect. But then we kind of spent more time just kind of putting some more framing around the question, making sure we understood really kind of the depth and nature of it. So if you did not listen to that, you should go back and listen to that. And then just even before we started really talking about the solutions, we spent episode last time just kind of talking about wrestling. When you've got some issue, be it theological or biblical or personal or moral or whatever, that's kind of deep and weighty, how do you wrestle with it? You know, splitting the difference between, a simplistic approach to faith and an overly intellectual approach to faith. How do we wrestle with these sorts of issues? And we spent some time talking about that. But I feel like before you and I are done, we should at least answer the question beyond just yes, no. So I'm going to ask this just in the broadest way possible. When we think about the God of the Old Testament and the God and Jesus in the New Testament being so different, you obviously do believe that they are the same. So how do you answer that question, Scott? I guess the better phrasing is, why do you believe that they are the same?
Yeah, no, that's I think that's a great kind of framing for it as well. That I think sometimes, and I've even in my journey of coming to faith and then learning just about this, I sometimes kind of feel like there was Adam and Eve and then a whole bunch of mistakes, and then finally God had to fix it all with Jesus. And then so he doesn't say, well, why didn't Adam and Eve just give birth to Jesus? It seems like that would have been the most direct route. Let's just fix this right now. Let's get this
right, for sure.
And so then you're confronted with either God didn't have a backup plan, and so he's like, y'all figure it out for a few thousand years. I'll get back to you. So you have that, which obviously not the case.
Right.
Or that time is part of the story itself. That it wasn't like a Adam and Eve sinned. Let me get back to you. Nor was it, let's fix this right now. That this is actually part of the story. That we can't understand Jesus if we don't understand this part of the story. And so that's. I think that we can start high level, but I feel like that's part of this. That even in the way every parable Jesus taught, every miracle he did, every teaching he gave is pointing back to something in the Old Testament, and that it's not just a coincidence or a literary a mechanism device, but it's actually it's because this is our story. This is our whole story, and that Jesus is part of that story, but it's not Adam and Eve sinned. We need Jesus. Let's get Jesus here as fast as possible. But that time in between is critical to this, that we can't understand Jesus without understanding that. And I've just kind of learned to embrace that over time.
Okay. So there's a thread here then, right? So there's a big picture story that God is telling, and it's the same story. You feel like it's one story? Some people say that. Sometimes I don't know if that sounds simplistic, but you feel like the Bible is overall just telling one big story.
Yeah, so I do, and I say that with the also holding the truth of, and I still wrestle with that,
Right.
so I see the more that I study, that I marinate in this, the more I see like this is one beautiful, messy, comprehensive story. And there are still parts of it that I'm still trying to figure out, do I even have all the pieces I need to understand this part of the story well? So both at the same time, but the more I lean into it, the more I find these just beautiful connections of one cohesive story that even to this day is still going on, even though new scriptures is being written. But you can speak truths into today's culture, today's world that start from Genesis 1:1, and I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, you've got this comprehensive story, right? Adam and Eve, Jesus, and you got this, like you said, this huge gap in between, where, like you said, he seemed to let it go on longer than he should have. And then there's various gaps where there's the same thing, like the 400 years between when the last prophet and the coming of Jesus. The 400 years he allowed Israelites to be enslaved in Egypt. I mentioned this before, the 120 years between I'm going to take out the world by flood and the actual execution of that. There seems to be these long gaps, and we're experiencing one now where Jesus said he was coming back soon. Well,
2,000 years of any day now.
reckon that word a little differently, what soon means. I mean, there's just also, God just seems to let things go a while.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't like that, and sometimes we do, depending, I guess, on which end of it we're on. But it's like, even that, I feel like, is a picture of the goodness and graciousness of God. I mean, one of the things that God says about himself, that the Bible says, and then some of the authors like the psalmist will affirm it, that he is slow to anger.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you read a story and in 2 chapters, or just all in this, the story of Noah is all 1 chapter. So in 1 chapter, God went from, okay, I'm out. I'm taking y'all all out. And then by the end there was a flood. It's like, dang. And it was just 2 chapters ago that he'd created everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, he seemed like to have regretted it really, really quickly. It was a long time. If you do the math on this person lived these many years, he let it go a long time. Yeah. And so there seems to be something there of just a God that just kind of will let things play out a lot longer, a very slow to judgment sort of God.
Yeah.
And so what else? So what is the nature then of this story? What are these threads? Because some of the things that you mentioned that don't make sense were, there's all these rules in the Old Testament, and then you've got Jesus in the New Testament. How do those two things work together then?
Yeah, that's great. And I think part of what I love about how the book of Genesis lays out is that if you could take the book of Genesis and simmer it down to the point that you could use it to teach a 2-year-old or 3-year-old about who God is, and then as a 100-year-old, you're still exploring the depths of it, that you're still wrestling with it. And I think some of the themes that we see, to kind of get to your question, show up in the first 3 or 4 chapters of Genesis. That, first of all, you see that God created everything and everything was good. And I think that's a truth that we know it to be true, but I think sometimes we brush over it, that we sometimes think God created everything and he's regretted it and hated it ever since. And that, that Jesus is the only hope for this world that he created, and which is true. But to remember that he started from, he loves everything he made. He loves it. Like, it's good. And to start there, that's a truth we need to hold on to, whether we're 3 years old or 100 years old. And that's a theme that we see throughout, because I feel like in the first few chapters of Genesis, we're introduced like 3 big themes that you see just this cyclical repetition of, all the way to the point of Christ coming. And if we can kind of use these threads to kind of thread the buttons, that you can start to see the narrative together. So the first one being that God is just absolutely in love with, proud of, happy with good creation. The second is, when on the, in the story of the 7 days of creation, that whether you believe it's a literal 7 days or it's more of a framework for telling a story, regardless of how you read it, there's a pattern to it that you see that God's creating light and darkness, sea and atmosphere, land and sea, separating things, and then the first 3 days, and then the next 3 days he starts to put things in place to govern those things. So he puts sun and moon on the fourth day to govern the light and darkness. He puts fish and birds in the air to govern the air and the seas. He puts animals and humans on the sixth day. And so it's interesting that on the sixth day, and then the seventh day being the day that God shows his supremacy over all things. But the fact that we're made on the same day as animals, I think we live in this kind of, you've said it a few times, this kind of postmodern, post-alignment, where we see that we almost have this view of like mankind, and even more specifically like myself, like I'm the main character, I'm the center of it all.
Mm-hmm.
But when you step back and think, like the most fundamental level, like, are humans animals, or are we gods? Are we the God of kind of all this? The main character syndrome, to your point. That's a struggle I think we all deal with. Like, and so God starts to, on the sixth day, he creates animals and humans, and on seventh day, sets himself apart. And so the first kind of struggle that Adam and Eve have is, are we God? And so, with the garden, the tree in the garden, the tree of knowledge, that's this like way of God saying that, by honoring this, the place of this tree, the role of this tree, you're honoring me, you're honoring my role, that you are not God. And so, which we fail. And I think all of us can relate to that at some point. And then you have, the story of Cain and Abel, where, coming after that. So we have Abel raises livestock. He's learned how to kind of, as God told mankind, to fill the earth, be fruitful, to kind of master our like kind of animal tendencies. That Abel was learning how to do that through, domesticating animal, like in a very physical way. Whereas Cain, and brought that offering to God. Whereas Cain, like an animal, like gathered fruits and brought that to God. And God didn't shun Cain. God said, "Thank you, Cain," but showed preference to Abel's, that because Abel was learning to do the thing that God had called us to do. And so, Cain gets upset, murders Abel, and so he gives into this animal instinct. And God even says, like, be careful about indulging your animal instincts, because it sins there like a predator ready to devour you. And so we have these three themes. So sorry, that was kind of long-winded, but we have these three themes that really like just start to expand as the story of Scripture goes on. The first being that God is just absolutely in love with everything he made. The second is that humans are very special, that we're not God, and that we're not man, that we have to learn, we're not animals. Right. And we have to learn how to occupy that space between not setting ourselves as the gods of all things, and not indulging ourselves with kind of animal appetites, so to speak. And so, as you start to see like the story of, you get to the flood, it says by that time, the thing that grieved God wasn't that people had bad theological views. Like the thing that grieved God was that people were so violent against each other, and there was no one left to stand up for the oppressed, for those who were being, at the bottom of the pecking order, so to speak, of violence. And so we had given into these animal appetites of basically survival of the fittest, dominance. And so, so we had kind of banked toward that, being like animals. When you see the Tower of Babel, we start to try to organize ourselves to build towers, and you keep going further ahead, and you see, fast forward to Egypt's time, and you see that now we've become even more organized as far as enslaving other humans as a very animal way. And it's that our sinful tendencies are becoming more and more and more organized as time goes on. And that's the world that we live in. I think even if Jesus had come second, Adam and Eve, Jesus, we'd still be dealing with a world where those things were true, but we wouldn't have this story of God walking with us through it to show us what it means to be loved, to occupy this space between not being God and not being kind of an animal, like right. Or something set apart from that.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, you got this idea that, again, God created everything, and he loves it, and then we are a unique. We share a unique place in that, and then the way that I say it is like, it's very clear to everybody that the world is broken.
Yep.
We broke it. We broke it. And then the story of the Bible is, what is God going to do about the fact that we broke the world that he made?
Yeah.
And you see, God doing different things at different seasons with different sorts of people. But it seems like his reactions are all in the same ballpark. He's like, I don't like it. And so there are consequences. I don't want you to do it anymore. And I would rather forgive you than us be cross.
Mm-hmm.
And so just a cycle of consequences, repentance, and forgiveness. People will describe the book of Judges that way, that's kind of what it is. It's like they're living their life, they do something dumb, God brings consequences, they're sorry, God delivers them.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's a cycle that goes through, but it's not limited to the book of Judges. I mean, it's all throughout everything.
Yeah.
We see that cycle that ultimately has its best and biggest rotation in the person of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I feel like in everything that you see, from Adam, God killing the animal to give them skins, to the things that happen in Judges, to Moses through the Exodus, through what happens to them in the exile and being brought back from the exile, everything has that's little bitty iterations of the story of, we did something dumb, broke the world, or broke it further, broke ourselves, broke our relationship with God. There are consequences to that. And then it is God's desire that through those consequences that our hearts would turn, and he is always there to forgive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even I agree. And that cycle, you see it. What I love about it is you see it on a micro level, like in one story in Judges, you see that cycle. If you look at Judges as a whole, you see that cycle. If you zoom out and look at, the entirety of the Old Testament, you see that cycle like in macro, and it's almost like this fractal that even down to an individual human life, that in my own life, I see this, I'm learning to occupy this space where I embrace that I'm loved by God, that I'm not trying to put myself, it's the banks of I am God, the banks of just indulging whatever appetite I have, to live in that space. And so one of the things I love is that, it is something that you see just on a micro level and a macro level, and it's something that I can relate to just all too personally, sometimes woefully so.
Yeah, and I feel like one of the best things that you said, came very early on, talking about when Jesus is talking about himself, and he's talking about his relationship to God and his relationship to the Old Testament scriptures. He saw himself as the obvious manifestation and fulfillment of everything that you've read. You've read these stories. I mean, he did famously in one of his very first sermons. He gets up at church, my bad. Sorry for the anachronism, guys. He gets up, pulls out a scroll, reads something, sits down, and is like, it's talking about me, guys. Right? I mean, he and the walk to Emmaus post-resurrection, he's sitting there and explaining them through the scriptures. Here is everything here is pointing to me. The Stephen's speech in Acts was that way. The apostles were this way. Paul was this way. They were all this way. They felt like that they could tell you everything you needed to know about Jesus just from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So everybody who knew the Old Testament, they knew the Old Testament better than we did, and they had encountered the actual Jesus. All of them felt like, oh, if you look at it the right way, all you'll see is Jesus. Mm-hmm. He's been prepping us for this whole time, and then there he is, and then somehow we bring into this some discord that Jesus himself didn't even experience. None of his followers experienced. There's a congruence there. I mean, even with, like I said, even with the law is just another example of that same cycle. And the way that Paul describes it is, he gave you this to show you what it would really take to be perfect,
Mm-hmm.
to expose the fact that you're not God, to show you the difference between what it would take to not be an animal, and to show you this huge gap that you need for repentance and forgiveness. And he's like, if anything, it was just kind of this alarm. He's lots of different metaphors, a steward, a pointer. Like it was, hey, and here's Jesus. He's the answer to this thing that you can't solve,
Mm-hmm.
which is I can't be perfect. And again, I think there's a culture blindness I think that we have.
Yeah.
So how do we overcome that? How can we break through that and see the cohesion, to see the one story? How do we break out of this? I think again, this culturally limiting thing that we have.
Yeah. No, that's good. And in the seminar, we talked a little bit about just a few kind of different ways you could approach that. Like one thing, if so, first time I, new believer, 19 years old, I was like, okay, I'm going to read the Bible all the way through. And so I started, I'm trucking along through Genesis, make it through the end of Genesis, get into Exodus. And somewhere around maybe Leviticus, I just kind of, what are we even, like, I started to just kind of lose the context.
What are we on about here?
Yeah. And so, since then I've read through, cover to cover, verse by verse several times. But if someone's listening to this and has I've tried that and I can't ever make it past X. I feel like a good place to start sometimes is even you said this, like, look at Jesus's own words. Like, he quotes the Old Testament many times, and even that scroll that he reads from Isaiah, he's not just quoting the verse from Isaiah, because if you read that passage in Isaiah, the passage in Isaiah isn't necessarily even talking about Jesus per se. It's talking about something that was happening at the time, in the time that Isaiah was writing this. But Jesus harkens back to it, and when you pull back from even just the scripture itself, you start to see, like, okay, the times that Isaiah is living in, that's the same times that Jesus is encountering now. And so the fulfillment is like, yeah, these words are exactly about me. Isaiah was pointing ahead to me. But if you go back and like pull out a little bit and start to understand, okay, what was happening in Isaiah's time, and let me read a few chapters before and after this, and start to really understand like what's he talking about. That can be a kind of good beachheads, so to speak, into the Old Testament. That if you start where you're comfortable in the New Testament,
that's good,
and go back, and then just kind of you start to, if you're video game players, sometimes there are these games where you have a map, and some parts of the map are blacked out, and as you start to explore, the map starts to kind of reveal itself. And so that can be a way to kind of just start to get glimpses of the map. If Jesus quotes a psalm, go read the whole psalm. When Jesus is hanging on the cross and says, "Why, O God, have you forsaken me?" That's a psalm quote. And if you go back and read that psalm, you see this picture of what suffering looks like. And it was David's suffering, but then you also see this like looking forward to reconciliation, resurrection. And so, if you just read what Jesus quoted, that's from Psalms. But if you go back and read the Psalm, you start to really understand what Jesus is doing that time, and you start to get your view of the Old Testament just grows just a little bit more. And so I feel like that's a good strategy for people who have like started from Genesis 1 and just keep getting lost, keep getting derailed. Is start where you're comfortable and go back. But then secondarily, like as you start to become more comfortable, to actually go through entire books or sections. And there's some really great companions, some great companion Bibles, great companion podcasts, great companion like resources that can help you just understand. One great example is Abraham doing the sacrifice where he just on his own, like when he encounters God, he says, "Okay, I'm going to cut a pigeon and I forget the three things, a ram and something else in half, and just walk through the halves." And you're like, why would that ever cross your mind as a way? But like you learn, like, oh, that was actually a really common sacrifice at the time. Like way of making a vow at the time. And we learn about that, and you start to get this like deeper, more complex view of who Abraham was and what he was actually doing in that moment. And so, so I'd say that's the second approach, is actually just read through it and like find some good resources that can and take the long, maybe not have the goal of like, I'm gonna read through the whole Old Testament with this companion, because you might spend a whole day reading just 3 or 4 verses, but all this companion material is just feeding you. But to not set a goal and read the
Right.
entire Old Testament. I'm just going to focus on this story, this character, this book, whatever it might be. And that can be a great way for it to kind of come alive to you.
We'll end with this. So one of the things we've talked about in this podcast is we're kind of trying to rank, as it is, kind of theological issues. And so the one thing we describe is the soil, like you're building a theological house.
Okay.
We'll move right. So, and the dirt is, where am I building my house? And I wanted to build my house in Christian dirt. I want to be a Christian. So the things that are absolutely essential are the things that are in the dirt. All right. Then there's the foundational things, which are like, okay, these are the things that, I can be a Christian and maybe be wrong on these things for a little while, but if I'm wrong on them for too long, my foundation's going to be broken. Then there's the pillars that support your house, and then there's things that are just decorative. This wrestling of who God is, the unity between the Old Testament and New Testament, is it essential? Is it foundational? Is it just important? Or is this just interesting?
That's great. I'd love your thoughts on this because we might even have different points of view on it. But I'd say that elements of everything we've talked about are actually dirt issues, foundation issues, framing issues, and
well said. Well said.
I'd say
who God is in the dirt.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
exactly. And then this idea of is the God of the Old Testament the same as the God of the New Testament? That's a dirt issue.
Yeah.
How Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, maybe a foundation issue. Like we might, there's a little bit of it's foundational, but it's not. If we know who God is, we're unified on that. You're building upon it. But then there are things where it's like, who commanded David to do the census?
Right.
That's maybe a frame, maybe a drywall issue. It's maybe a little more important than where am I going to put this bookshelf, but not. It's not a frame of a house kind of issue, and we can wrestle with that. But we're not wrestling with foundational or dirt issues. But I think a lot of times the temptation is to make something that's kind of this ancillary, maybe a drywall issue, make it suddenly a dirt issue, and I think we can do that a lot in how we approach this New Testament, Old Testament view.
I have nothing to add to that. Well said. Well said. Thank you so much for being with us these last few episodes. Appreciate your insight and wisdom, and you're sharing that with the church at the SummerSlam, and just also here with the podcast. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us. And I hope to see you again soon. Thank you for listening to the Cultivate Podcast. Our hope is that you are taking steps to go deeper in your faith, that you are asking big questions and you're looking for answers. We hope that we can be a resource for you through our podcast and any other way that we can help you. You can find all our episodes anywhere that you can find podcasts, including YouTube. And again, thank you so much for joining us.